Minions in Season 2 feel like they finally hit their stride. Instead of being reliant on cheap gimmicks and weird interactions, they're now just big, powerful beasts that beat the crap out of demons. They have tons of health, tons of tankiness, and tons of attack damage. We no longer rely on the Ring of Mendelm, and instead, we just give our minions tons of attack speed and tons of damage, and they just beat everything down. In terms of overall power, I would rate minions as a solid A tier build. Farming with them is an absolute breeze. They're so tanky and so durable. Anything up to like an 85 Nightmare Dungeon, you're going to have no issues at all. It's going to be extremely chill to farm. Once you get above 85, they can start to struggle with survivability, but everything else is an absolute breeze. Overworld content is so easy. You just walk around and pick up loot while your minions kill everything. On top of this, minions is also incredibly easy to assemble. This build only makes use of one unique, and I would say that that unique is even optional. Let's just jump straight into the skill tree and start breaking down how this build is working. So for starters, we're going to be running Reap with Acolyte's Reap. I feel like I've said that phrase 100 times, but the corpse generation, the survivability, everything about Reap is just amazing. And the core skills are going to be putting 3 points into Hewed Flesh. This is going to give us a lot of extra corpses, which is useful for both proccing Necrotic Carapace, but also for keeping up our minions. Moving on, we're going to be putting 1 point into Spiked Armor. So if you don't know, minions do not proc lucky hits on their attacks, but they do proc lucky hit on thorns. This is very important because of something we're going to talk about in a minute. And so we have to have at least 1 point of thorns somewhere in the build. It can come from your gear, it can come from a gem in your armor, but I prefer to take the skill point for it. We're going to be putting 3 points into Skeletal Warrior Mastery for the increased life and damage. We're also going to be putting 3 points into Fueled by Death. This is just a straight up 9% damage multiplier. This will proc whenever we use Raised Skeleton. We're going to be putting 3 points into Death's Embrace. This will give a small amount of survivability and damage to our minions, and it's also going to give us some much needed survivability. 3 points into Amplified Damage, because we're going to be cursing enemies all the time, so it's just a straight up damage multiplier. 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery for, again, another damage multiplier for our mages. And then we get into Decrepify. So, Decrepify, by default, slows enemies and reduces their damage by 20%. Abhorrent Decrepify gives us a 15% chance to reduce our active cooldowns by 1 second whenever we hit an enemy afflicted by Decrepify. Now, our minions with the thorns are going to proc Decrepify like crazy, and it's going to substantially reduce the cooldown on all of our skills. This includes Corpse Tendrils, the Golem active, and our ultimate ability. This is an incredibly important interaction for the build. Because our Bone Storm, we're going to be running the full Bone Storm suite. I'm talking the aspect of Shielding Storm, and the aspect that turns Bone Storm into a Darkness skill so it leaves the dot. And because our Bone Storm is replicated in our Golem, this represents a tremendous amount of damage and survivability. We're going to be putting 5 points into Corpse Tendrils. The extra points will just reduce its cooldown, and we're actually going to be going all the way to Blinded Corpse Tendrils. So this Blood Orb generation from Corpse Tendrils is really important. The vulnerable application we're going to be getting from our Vampiric power, so we don't need the vulnerable on Corpse Tendrils, and with the most recent patch going into Season 2, Blood Orbs now heal your minions by default. So these extra Blood Orbs that we're generating from the Corpse Tendrils actually have really high value. We're going to be putting 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit. This is just going to give us 15% move speed whenever we reap or whenever an enemy gets hit by our Bone Storm. Moving on, we're going to be taking 3 points into Necrotic Carapace. This is going to give us Fortify whenever we generate a corpse from one of our skills or our minions. Remember, Hewed Flesh, so every hit that we have has a chance to make a corpse. And because of the different runes that we're playing, our minions are going to generate a ton of corpses. These 3 points are going to keep us fully fortified all of the time. The fortified generation is honestly ridiculous. Moving on to the ultimate skills, we're going to be putting 3 points into Golem Mastery. With all the changes that happened in Season 2, your Golem now represents a huge chunk of your damage. So this passive is very important. We're going to be taking 3 points into Inspiring Leader for a 12% attack speed buff, and 3 points into Hellbent Commander for a 30% damage multiplier. 3 points into Bonded in Essence. Now, this did get nerfed going into Season 2, which really sucks because so much of our minion survivability comes from this ability. It was moved from 6 seconds to 8 seconds for the 60% heal. But still, we need to take 3 points into this. It's absolutely essential. Always keep up your Skeletal Priest buff. We're also going to be putting 3 points into Death's Defense, which is going to give our minions some much needed survivability. Now, Bone Storm. This is the crux of the build. Bone Storm is going to give us damage reduction 15%, critical strike chance 20%, and your minions will inherit 30% of that critical strike chance, so they'll end up getting about 7% crit chance from this. And we're going to be running, as mentioned previously, the full Bone Storm suite. We're going to get into exactly how that's all working when we get into the aspects, but if you're familiar with Necro, you know what we're doing here. And as part of the Bone Storm suite, we are going to be running Shadow Blight for our Keystone passive. This key passive is going to basically do absolutely nothing other than proc a legendary effect. That legendary effect is the Blighted aspect. This will give us a 180% damage multiplier after we proc Shadow Blight 10 times. Shadow Blight is procced by doing shadow damage, and we're going to be running the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which is going to turn our Bone Storm into a shadow skill and give it a dot. Okay, so what's happening is that whenever we cast Bone Storm, we get the Bone Storm, the Golem gets the Bone Storm, it's hitting everything around us constantly, it's generating crazy amounts of barrier, it's proccing the crap out of Shadow Blight, which is proccing this aspect, and then it just goes off, man, it just goes off. We're going to be running Flicker Step. This is going to give us a huge amount of cooldown reduction on the Bone Storm. Each time we evade through an enemy, it's going to reduce the cooldown of Bone Storm by 4 seconds. And this is capped at 10 seconds per dash. This easily gives us 100% uptime on Bone Storm. The Occult Dominion and Bloodgatter's aspects are going to both increase the number of skeletons we can summon. So we're going to get 2 more warriors and 2 more mages. This represents a lot of extra damage, extra corpses, everything you could want. The aspect of Might is going to give us 20% damage reduction after we use a basic skill. And because we're going to be spamming Reap, this should be up 100% of the time. On our pants, we're going to be getting the aspect of Shielding Storm. As I mentioned before, this interaction is absolutely crazy. You have ridiculous barrier generation. Your Golem doubles it. It's wild. And then on our ring, we're going to be running the aspect of Frenzied Dead. This aspect is going to represent about a 42% damage increase for our minions. While there are other sources of damage increases, this is still a wild damage increase. And then finally, let's talk about the weapon. So the weapon is an extremely important thing. You need to use a two-handed scythe. This is because the two-handed scythe has the slowest attack speed in the game, which means it has the highest damage. Minions don't scale off your weapon's attack speed, only its damage. So make sure you use a two-handed scythe. We're going to be putting the aspect of reanimation onto this scythe, and that's going to be an 80% damage multiplier that will hit our golem and our skeletons. Moving on to the vampiric powers, we're going to be playing Metamorphosis. You're going to see this ability in literally every single Necromancer build. All Necromancer builds struggle with Unstoppable, and on top of that, the Affliction of the Curse from this, in combination with Prey on the Weak, gives you 100% uptime on Vulnerable on all enemies. So this is an incredibly powerful interaction, and Prey on the Weak is also going to give us a 16% damage multiplier. We're going to be running Domination, so we're going to be constantly CCing enemies with, corpse tendrils and all that. But the thing is that this execute is actually quite powerful. So whenever an enemy is injured and they become stunned, they're executed. The thing about minions is that in high density situations, they're going to just be hitting random stuff. And a lot of the minions attacks are either small AoE or single target. So cleaning up all these random little mobs can actually really help us kill elites. We're going to be running Anticipation. This is just going to give us 20% better uptime on Bone Storm. And while it's not needed in all cases, this is particularly useful against bosses. Coven's Fangs is going to give our minions an additional 52% damage multiplier whenever enemies are CC'd. The lucky hit effect to apply Vampiric Curse isn't really that big of a deal, but the 52% damage to CC is, so we're going to be constantly trying to slow and stun enemies. Now, the Paragon board is the biggest difference between old builds and this modern build. In older builds, because we were reliant so much on the Ring of Mendeln to do our damage, we didn't really pay that much attention to the overall minions' damage and survivability. We just kind of threw them at the wall and hoped they lived. But this is no longer the case. We are now beefing up our minions on our Paragon board, giving them as much survivability as possible. We're also going to be trying to give them as much damage as possible. This board is so much cooler than the older boards. For ourselves, though, we want to get as much resist all as possible. And also, any armor nodes that we can pick up are definitely useful. For our first board, we're going to be taking Amplify. So Amplify is going to buff up these armor nodes, which is quite nice, but it's also going to give us a 10% damage multiplier. Moving on to the Cult Leader board. If you guys have studied minions before, you know how important this glyph is. This is the Dead Razor glyph. The Dead Razor glyph is going to increase the effect of nearby minion glyphs, specifically Custody. Custody is giving us almost 40% damage reduction. And then you have all these nodes around it that are also giving 10% apiece. This is a crazy amount of damage reduction for your minions. Cult Leader is going to give us a straight up 45% damage multiplier. This is incredibly strong. You can see that this board doesn't look anything like normal Paragon boards because we're actually going after all of these rare glyphs. The reason that we're doing that is because these rare glyphs are adding so much survivability to our minions. For example, this one is giving the minions 16% armor and 10% life. This survivability is so important. This one is giving them resist all. We have to pick these up. Moving on, we're going into the Flesh Eater. So Flesh Eater is going to get procced just from spamming Raised Skeleton, and it's going to give us a 40% damage multiplier. For our glyph on this board, we're going to be running Gravekeeper. This is in large part to buff the rare node, but at the same time, our corpse generation is crazy. Like I said, that golem, the bone golem, dumps corpses. There's some weird interaction, and it just dumps corpses. So we're actually able to get really good uptime on Gravekeeper for the 12% damage multiplier. Moving on to the Golem board, you're going to see that this board looks a lot like our Dead Razor board. And we're getting all of these glyphs. And the nice thing is that we're actually easily getting the extra effect from these glyphs, even though it's our third board, which sometimes that can create an issue. But we're actually easily getting all these effects. And because the Golem is like 50% of our overall damage, it's so important that we buff him up. For our glyph on this board, we're going to be running the glyph Mage, which is going to, most importantly, give all of our minions 35% elemental resistance. Again, just trying to get them as tanky as possible. On our final board, we're going to be grabbing Scent of Death. Like I mentioned, there's very often going to be a ton of corpses around us for the 15% damage reduction, but in some cases where there isn't, it's a 15% damage buff, so it's always doing something. We're going to be taking Warrior for our glyph on this board for the 30% armor for our minions. Again, beefcake minions, man. Just buff them up, you know, and send them in. And you can see how tanky and durable and hard-hitting our minions are, in large part because of our Paragon board, but also because of our aspects that we've chosen. I hope you guys liked today's video. I'm so excited that minions are back and in the state that they're in. If you guys liked it, make sure you leave a like and a comment. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment down below, and I'll get to it as soon as I can. My name is Ruse, and I'll see you guys in the next one.